Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. TCU heading into 2024, at least in my mind, a fascinating program. And we saw Sonny Dykes go to the transfer portal, add over 20 transfers, a lot of these guys with extensive experience at the college football level. I think that makes you feel pretty good about what the floor is going to be for TCU. There's a lot of experience. There's a lot of depth on this team. I think the question for TCU fans is, all right, what's the ceiling for this TCU program in 2024 look like? Want to get into, what I think about this roster, where some of the strong points are, where some of the question marks are, and then take a look at the schedule and talk about the floor and ceiling for this TCU roster heading into 2024. Fired up to get into it. Before we do it, as always, just want to say thank you to you guys. Many of y'all know these are kind of my favorite episodes to do in the off season, where we get to kind of put a stake in the ground and kind of call our shots with these teams heading into 2024. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, and for the TCU fans, I would love to hear some players that I might be missing, that I should be adding to my notebook heading into 2024. I learned a ton from you guys in the comment section. If you want to drop your schedule predictions as well in there, we'll chop it up down in the comment section. Without further ado, let's get into this one. Let's start at the quarterback spot with Josh Hoover, Ken Seals. Kind of an interesting quarterback room for TCU. Haas Haney as well, true freshman, a guy that I was a massive fan of at the high school ranks. I would think Josh Hoover is going to be your starting quarterback, at least from what I've read during spring practice. He's kind of the guy, and there's a lot to like about what we saw from Josh Hoover. Now, was the consistency where we wanted to see it? No, probably not. He was also a redshirt freshman with very limited experience in the 2023 season, but we saw him during the last 4 games of 2023 throw for over 300 yards in every single one of those games. He's a guy that, again, not necessarily top 10 NFL draft talent in terms of arm talent, but a guy that gets the ball out quick and is not afraid to make some high-level throws. But I think what's more intriguing for TCU on the offensive side of the football is the kind of difference makers they have in the wide receiver room. When you bring in a guy in Eric McAllister who excels working vertically down the field, the first thing that stands out to me about TCU's wide receiver room is just the amount of matchup nightmares and size that they have. You look at Eric McAllister, 6'4", 200 pounds. You look at Savion Williams, 6'5", 225 pounds. Dalen Wright, 6'2", 215 pounds. I mean, there is some big bodies at this wide receiver position. Obviously, J.P. Richardson has played really good football for TCU as well. How does Kendall Briles get to work with all these difference makers in the wide receiver room is probably the biggest question I have, because you have guys that have really unique physical traits, frames, and skill sets. Can you find those matchups that favor TCU on the offensive side of the football? That's one of the questions that you have. You look at the running back room, you have to replace Imani Bailey, who, and quite frankly, was one of the best running backs in the Big 12 last year. Cam Cook was another one of those high schoolers that I really liked for TCU in the 2023 class, a guy that gives you some real dynamic playmaking ability. And if you can find ways to get Cam Cook in space, good things are going to happen. You didn't see a ton of him as a true freshman, but I think we all know from the high school ranks and what we heard during spring practice, Cam Cook can be a difference maker in the running back room. I think one of the question marks that a lot of TCU fans have about this roster is the offensive line, where you hammer the transfer portal. Pretty much bring in a ton of new faces that are going to make up your starting 5 on the offensive line. Now, one thing you like, really experienced. I mean, you go down the list, a lot of redshirt seniors, a lot of redshirt juniors. This is an experienced offensive line, one of the more experienced offensive lines and older offensive lines that we're going to see in the country. I think the bigger question is, with all these new faces getting injected into the offensive line, how does this unit come together from a chemistry standpoint? Yeah, we feel pretty confident about the players on the offensive line, the personnel, but we do see teams struggle to kind of bring in 3-4 new faces on the offensive line and kind of hit the ground running in a college football season. I think the sheer experience makes you feel pretty good that this offensive line might come together. That being said, we want to see it come together in the 2024 year. You got some difference makers on the offensive side of the football. And on top of that, I mean, Sonny Dykes, Kendall Briles, those are 2 of the better offensive-minded coaches that you see in the country. You kind of trust that TCU is going to be able to put some points on the board. Now, I think the bigger question in terms of the ceiling for this TCU team, how good can they be in the Big 12? Can they compete for a Big 12 championship? Comes on the defensive side of the football, where I think the strength of this unit is in the linebacker room. I think you have some serious difference makers. It's been a strength for TCU's defense for multiple years now. You look at a guy like Nnamdi, whether he's rushing the passer, whether he's going sideline to sideline, that's one of the better linebackers that you see in the Big 12. Johnny Hodges, ton of experience. Marcel Brooks, a guy that hasn't really stayed healthy, but we all know the athleticism that he brings to the table. You bring in Andy Alvalos, How can he use these dynamic kids in the linebacker room to manufacture some turnovers and negative plays that you did so well in 2022, but kind of dried up in 2023? This was a TCU defense that was not necessarily going to smother you and kind of limit you to 10, 13 points, but they were going to create negative plays. They were going to create turnovers. That was the recipe for this TCU defense being a difference maker in 2022. Can you get back to that kind of level of defense where you are creating negative plays and creating turnovers like you did in 2022? I don't think we have many question marks about the linebacker spot. And quite frankly, I really do like what you have in the secondary. It's a lot of experience with some really good players. Guys like Bud Clark, Avery Helm played some pretty solid football. You bring in a lot of veterans in the transfer portal, in the back end. You just feel like the secondary is going to be solid. I don't know if it's going to be a top 10 unit in the country, but it's really hard to see this secondary being a liability for TCU in the 2024 season. My big question mark with TCU in terms of reaching that ceiling, if you will, it comes on the defensive line, where you just didn't have your difference makers that you had in 2022. I go back to 2022, guys like Dylan Horton. I mean, those were guys that you could rely on to create some havoc, to create some negative plays. You go back to last year, you didn't really have a guy that went over 4.5 sacks last year. You were very reliant on your linebackers, guys like Nnamdi, Jamoy Hodge, to create a lot of pass rush. That's not necessarily a spot you want to be in. You want to rely on your defensive linemen to be able to create some negative plays, get after the quarterback, cause a little chaos in the backfield. For TCU last year, you didn't really have that. Can this TCU defensive line get a little bit more aggressive in that front seven, create some more negative plays, create some more turnovers? That's probably the question that you have on the defensive side of the football, because, again, that secondary, it's going to be a really solid group. There's just too many experienced, solid football players for it not to be. I think you have a linebacker room that you can get really creative in terms of how you want to use those kids. I think on the defensive line, that's the big question mark that at least I have heading into 2024. Going to the schedule, it's not an easy schedule in the Big 12. And I mean, predicting the Big 12 in terms of schedule predictions it's been nearly impossible. Now, you look at this TCU schedule. I mean, the first two games I think should be wins. You go on the road at Stanford. I think you're 10.5-point favorites against the Stanford team that is going through a lot of turnover, and they have a lot of new faces on that football team. They could potentially be starting a true freshman, at the quarterback spot. If TCU's as good as I think they can be, they should be winning that football game pretty easily. You get LIU at home. That should certainly be a win. UCF on the road at SMU, on the road at Kansas. That is where we're going to find out if this team can compete for a Big 12 championship, be one of those teams that's at the top half of the Big 12. You get UCF at home at night. That's massive. You should be 2-0 heading into that game. You look at UCF, they're going to run the football. They're going to put a lot of points up on the board. Can TCU match that? Can they deal with what UCF is going to be doing, run the football with guys like KJ Jefferson, RJ Harvey, and Penny Boone? That's going to be a game that I think a lot of TCU fans are going to be watching and say, that's how we figure out what this season is going to look like the rest of the way. You go on the road at SMU, that's going to be one of the more fun games that we see in all of college football. Again, an SMU team that I am high on heading into the 2024 year. Then you go on the road at Kansas. You're not playing in Lawrence. You're playing at Arrowhead Stadium. If I'm TCU and we can win 2 out of 3 of those games and kind of come out of that 5-game stretch being 5-1, that's ideal. Because then you get Houston at home going into your bye week. You have a chance, if you can go 2-1 in those 3-game stretches, at being a 6-1 ball club heading into your bye week. And then you start scrolling down and say, it doesn't get much easier. I mean, again, there's a lot of really good teams in the Big 12. You go on the road to Utah. That's really hard for me to at least sit here and pick TCU to win that football game. Utah, I mean, it's virtually impossible to beat at home. You get Texas Tech at home, another one of those toss-up games that if TCU reaches their potential, they're winning. You go on the road at Baylor. That's a road game that I think you certainly can win in the Big 12. You get Oklahoma State at home. That's another one of those teams that if you want, I mean, Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, those are toss-up games, but you get them both at home. I think that's absolutely massive. And again, if you are 6-1 or 5-2 going into the bye week, you got some momentum. And then you kind of feel better about where you sit in some of these games. And then you go Arizona at home again. And then you go on the road to Cincinnati, which should be a win. The back half of the schedule, outside of going on the road at Utah, you get Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, and Arizona at home. I'm not necessarily picking TCU to win those football games, but you feel a lot better that they're playing at home as opposed to going on the road to those environments. You get Cincinnati on the road. That should be a win. Not very high in Cincinnati heading into 2024. You take a look at the floor and ceiling for this team. I have the floor being 5-7, which feels low. I think it certainly could be 6-6. And why I think the floor is so high for TCU is there's just a lot of experience. There's a lot of guys on this roster that have played a lot of football, and it's a deep roster. I don't necessarily know if they have the top-end talent like they had in 2022 to make the college football playoffs, but you feel pretty good that TCU is going to be a very competitive team in 2024 because of the experience and depth they have on this roster. You look at the ceiling, again, projecting the Big 12 ceiling, it is nearly impossible. You look at TCU 2 years ago, nobody thought they'd win 10-plus games. They obviously do and go to the college football playoffs. And even last year, a team like Oklahoma State that we all kind of figured was dead in the water ends up being very good in the Big 12, making it to the Big 12 championship game. You have teams every single year that really surprise a lot of people. I think the ceiling for this team is 9-3. Do I think they get to 9 wins? It's hard to look at this schedule and find 9 wins that you feel good about. But again, the Big 12, if you have an experienced team that you can be consistent every single Saturday, you like your chances a little bit more. So I went with the 9-3 ceiling. Again, the Big 12, it's the Wild West out there. TCU, certainly a team that can make some noise. Would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. You got any impact players that the boys left out? Would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys. We'll talk to y'all later. Peace.